Chapter 21. The Maniac. The last bar that would make the opening large enough to permit his body to pass had been removed as Tarzan heard the warriors whispering beyond the stone door of his prison. Long since had the rope of hide been braided. To secure one end to the remaining bar that he had left for this purpose was the work of but a moment, and while the warriors whispered without, the brown body of the ape-man slipped through the small aperture and disappeared below the sill. Tarzan's escape from the cell left him still within the walled area that comprised the palace and temple grounds and buildings. He had reconnoitered as best he might from the window after he had removed enough bars to permit him to pass his head through the opening, so that he knew what lay immediately before him, a winding and usually deserted alleyway leading in the direction of the outer gate that opened from the palace grounds into the city. The darkness would facilitate his escape. He might even pass out of the palace and the city without detection. If he could elude the guard at the palace gate, the rest would be easy. He strode along confidently, exhibiting no fear of detection, for he reasoned that thus would he disarm suspicion. In the darkness he easily could pass for a hodan, and in truth, though he passed several after leaving the deserted alley, no one accosted or detained him, and thus he came at last to the guard of a half-dozen warriors before the palace gate. These he attempted to pass in the same unconcerned fashion, and he might have succeeded had it not been for one who came running rapidly from the direction of the temple shouting, "Let no one pass the gates. The prisoner has escaped from the Palul Jah." Instantly a warrior barred his way, and simultaneously the fellow recognized him. "Exotor," he exclaimed, "here he is now. Fall upon him. Fall upon him. Back! Back before I kill you." The others came forward. It cannot be said that they rushed forward. If it was their wish to fall upon him, there was a noticeable lack of enthusiasm other than that which directed their efforts to persuade someone else to fall upon him. His fame as a fighter had been too long a topic of conversation for the good of the morale of Mosa's warriors. It were safer to stand at a distance and hurl their clubs, and this they did, but the ape-man had learned something of the use of this weapon since he had arrived in Palul Dawn. And as he learned, great had grown his respect for this most primitive of arms. He had come to realize that the black savages he had known had never appreciated the possibilities of their knob sticks, nor had he, and he had discovered too why the Paluldonians had turned their ancient spears into plowshares and pinned their faith to the heavy-ended club alone. In deadly execution it was far more effective than a spear, and it answered to every purpose of a shield, combining the two in one and thus reducing the burden of the warrior. Thrown as they throw it, after the manner of the hammer throwers of the Olympian Games, an ordinary shield would prove more a weakness than a strength, while one that would be strong enough to prove a protection would be too heavy to carry. Only another club, deftly wielded to deflect the course of an enemy missile, is in any way effective against these formidable weapons, and too, the war club of Palul Dawn can be thrown with accuracy a far greater distance than any spear. And now was put to the test that which Tarzan had learned from Omat and Ta-Den. His eyes and his muscles, trained by a lifetime of necessity, moved with the rapidity of light, and his brain functioned with an uncanny celerity that suggested nothing less than prescience, and these things more than compensated for his lack of experience with the war club he handled so dexterously. Weapon after weapon he warded off, and always he moved with a single idea in mind, to place himself within reach of one of his antagonists. But they were wary, for they feared this strange creature to whom the superstitious fears of many of them attributed the miraculous powers of deity. They managed to keep between Tarzan and the gateway, and all the time they bowled lustily for reinforcements. Should these come before he had made his escape, the ape-man realized that the odds against him would be unsurmountable, and so he redoubled his efforts to carry out his design. Following their usual tactics, 2 or 3 of the warriors were always circling behind him, collecting the thrown clubs when Tarzan's attention was directed elsewhere. He himself retrieved several of them, which he hurled with such deadly effect as to dispose of 2 of his antagonists, but now he heard the approach of hurrying warriors, the patter of their bare feet upon the stone pavement, and then the savage cries which were to bolster the courage of their fellows and fill the enemy with fear. There was no time to lose. Tarzan held a club in either hand, and swinging one he hurled it at a warrior before him, and as the man dodged he rushed in and seized him, at the same time casting his second club at another of his opponents. The hodan with whom he grappled reached instantly for his knife, but the ape-man grasped his wrist. There was a sudden twist, the snapping of a bone, and an agonized scream. Then the warrior was lifted bodily from his feet and held as a shield between his fellows and the fugitive as the latter backed through the gateway. Beside Tarzan stood the single torch that lighted the entrance to the palace grounds. The warriors were advancing to the succor of their fellow when the ape-man raised his captive high above his head and flung him full in the face of the foremost attacker. The fellow went down, and two directly behind him sprawled headlong over their companion as the ape-man seized the torch and cast it back into the palace grounds to be extinguished as it struck the bodies of those who led the charging reinforcements. In the ensuing darkness, Tarzan disappeared in the streets of Tulur beyond the palace gate. For a time he was aware of sounds of pursuit, but the fact that they trailed away and died in the direction of Jad and Lul informed him that they were searching in the wrong direction, for he had turned south out of Tulur purposely to throw them off his track. Beyond the outskirts of the city he turned directly toward the northwest, in which direction lay a lur. In his path he knew lay Jad Bal Lul, the shore of which he was compelled to skirt, and there would be a river to cross at the lower end of the great lake upon the shores of which lay a lur. What other obstacles lay in his way he did not know, but he believed that he could make better time on foot than by attempting to steal a canoe and force his way upstream with a single paddle. It was his intention to put as much distance as possible between himself and Tulur before he slept, for he was sure that Mosar would not lightly accept his loss, but that with the coming of day, or possibly even before, he would dispatch warriors in search of him. A mile or two from the city he entered a forest, and here at last he felt such a measure of safety as he never knew in open spaces or in cities. The forest and the jungle were his birthright. No creature that went upon the ground upon 4 feet, or climbed among the trees, or crawled upon its belly had any advantage over the ape-man in his native heath. As myrrh and frankincense were the dank odors of rotting vegetation in the nostrils of the great Tarmangani. He squared his broad shoulders and lifting his head filled his lungs with the air that he loved best. The heavy fragrance of tropical blooms, the commingled odors of the myriad scented life of the jungle went to his head with a pleasurable intoxication far more potent than aught contained in the oldest vintages of civilization. He took to the trees now not from necessity but from pure love of the wild freedom that had been denied him so long. Though it was dark and the forest strange, yet he moved with a surety and ease that bespoke more a strange uncanny sense than wondrous skill. He heard Jah moaning somewhere ahead, and an owl hooted mournfully to the right of him, long familiar sounds that imparted to him no sense of loneliness as they might to you or to me, but on the contrary one of companionship, for they betokened the presence of his fellows of the jungle. And whether friend or foe, it was all the same to the ape-man. He came at last to a little stream at a spot where the trees did not meet above it, so he was forced to descend to the ground and wade through the water, and upon the opposite shore he stopped, as though suddenly his godlike figure had been transmuted from flesh to marble. Only his dilating nostrils bespoke his pulsing vitality. For a long moment he stood there thus, and then swiftly, but with a caution and silence that were inherent in him, he moved forward again, but now his whole attitude bespoke a new urge. There was a definite and masterful purpose in every movement of those steel muscles rolling softly beneath the smooth brown hide. He moved now toward a certain goal that quite evidently filled him with far greater enthusiasm than had the possible event of his return to Allur. And so he came at last to the foot of a great tree, and there he stopped and looked up above him among the foliage where the dim outlines of a roughly rectangular bulk loomed darkly. There was a choking sensation in Tarzan's throat as he raised himself gently into the branches. It was as though his heart were swelling either to a great happiness or a great fear. Before the rude shelter built among the branches he paused, listening. From within there came to his sensitive nostrils the same delicate aroma that had arrested his eager attention at the little stream a mile away. He crouched upon the branch close to the little door. "Jane," he called, "heart of my heart, it is I." The only answer from within was as the sudden indrawing of a breath that was half gasp and half sigh, and the sound of a body falling to the floor. Hurriedly Tarzan sought to release the thongs which held the door, but they were fastened from the inside, and at last, impatient with further delay, he seized the frail barrier in one giant hand, and with a single effort tore it completely away. And then he entered to find the seemingly lifeless body of his mate stretched upon the floor. He gathered her in his arms, her heart beat, she still breathed, and presently he realized that she had but swooned. When Jane Clayton regained consciousness, it was to find herself held tightly in 2 strong arms, her head pillowed upon the broad shoulder where so often before her fears had been soothed and her sorrows comforted. At first she was not sure but that it was all a dream. Timidly her hand stole to his cheek. "John," she murmured, "tell me, is it really you?" In reply he drew her more closely to him. "It is I," he replied. But there is something in my throat, he said haltingly, that makes it hard for me to speak. She smiled and snuggled closer to him. God has been good to us, Tarzan of the Apes, she said. For some time neither spoke. It was enough that they were reunited, and that each knew that the other was alive and safe. But at last they found their voices, and when the sun rose they were still talking. So much had each to tell the other, so many questions there were to be asked and answered. And Jack, she asked, where is he? I do not know, replied Tarzan. The last I heard of him he was on the Argonne front. Ah, then our happiness is not quite complete, she said, a little note of sadness creeping into her voice. No, he replied, but the same is true in countless other English homes today, and pride is learning to take the place of happiness in these. She shook her head. I want my boy, she said. And I too, replied Tarzan, and we may have him yet. He was safe and unwounded, the last word I had, and now he said we must plan upon our return. Would you like to rebuild the bungalow and gather together the remnants of our waziri, or would you rather return to London? Only to find Jack, she said. I dream always of the bungalow and never of the city, but John, we can only dream, for Burroughs told me that he had circled this whole country and found no place where he might cross the morass. I am not Burroughs, Tarzan reminded her, smiling. We will rest today, and tomorrow we will set out toward the north. It is a savage country, but we have crossed it once and we can cross it again. And so upon the following morning the Tarmangani and his mate went forth upon their journey across the valley of Jad Ben Otho, and ahead of them were fierce men and savage beasts, and the lofty mountains of Palul Dawn, and beyond the mountains the reptiles and the morass, and beyond that the arid, thorn-covered steppe, and other savage beasts and men and weary, hostile miles of untracked wilderness between them and the charred ruins of their home. Lieutenant Eric Burroughs crawled through the grass upon all fours, leaving a trail of blood behind him after Jane's spear had sent him crashing to the ground beneath her tree. He made no sound after the one piercing scream that had acknowledged the severity of his wound. He was quiet because of a great fear that had crept into his warped brain that the devil woman would pursue and slay him, and so he crawled away like some filthy beast of prey, seeking a thicket where he might lie down and hide. He thought that he was going to die, but he did not, and with the coming of the new day he discovered that his wound was superficial. The rough obsidian shod spear had entered the muscles of his side beneath his right arm, inflicting a painful, but not a fatal wound. With the realization of this fact came a renewed desire to put as much distance as possible between himself and Jane Clayton. And so he moved on, still going upon all fours because of a persistent hallucination that in this way he might escape observation. Yet though he fled, his mind still revolved muddily about a central desire. While he fled from her, he still planned to pursue her, and to his lust of possession was added a desire for revenge. She should pay for the suffering she had inflicted upon him. She should pay for rebuffing him, but for some reason which he did not try to explain to himself he would crawl away and hide. He would come back, though. He would come back, and when he had finished with her he would take that smooth throat in his 2 hands and crush the life from her. He kept repeating this over and over to himself, and then he fell to laughing out loud, the cackling, hideous laughter that had terrified Jane. Presently he realized his knees were bleeding, and that they hurt him. He looked cautiously behind. No one was in sight. He listened. He could hear no indications of pursuit, and so he rose to his feet and continued upon his way, a sorry sight, covered with filth and blood, his beard and hair tangled and matted and filled with burrs and dried mud and unspeakable filth. He kept no track of time. He ate fruits and berries and tubers that he dug from the earth with his fingers. He followed the shore of the lake and the river that he might be near water, and when Jah roared or moaned he climbed a tree and hid there, shivering. And so after a time he came up the southern shore of Jad Ben Lul until a wide river stopped his progress. Across the blue water a white city glimmered in the sun. He looked at it for a long time, blinking his eyes like an owl. Slowly a recollection forced itself through his tangled brain. This was Allur, the city of light. The association of ideas recalled Bulur and the Wazho Dawn. They had called him Jad Ben Otho. He commenced to laugh aloud and stood up very straight and strode back and forth along the shore. I am Jad Ben Otho, he cried. I am the great god. In Allur is my temple and my high priests. What is Jad Ben Otho doing here alone in the jungle? He stepped out into the water and raising his voice shrieked loudly across toward Allur. I am Jad Ben Otho, he screamed. Come hither, slaves, and take your god to his temple. But the distance was great, and they did not hear him, and no one came, and the feeble mind was distracted by other things, a bird flying in the air, a school of minnows swimming around his feet. He lunged at them, trying to catch them. And falling upon his hands and knees, he crawled through the water, grasping futilely at the elusive fish. Presently it occurred to him that he was a sea lion, and he forgot the fish, and lay down and tried to swim by wriggling his feet in the water as though they were a tail. The hardships, the privations, the terrors, and for the past few weeks the lack of proper nourishment had reduced Erich Obergatz to little more than a gibbering idiot. A water snake swam out upon the surface of the lake, and the man pursued it, crawling upon his hands and knees. The snake swam toward the shore just within the mouth of the river, where tall reeds grew thickly, and Obergatz followed, making grunting noises like a pig. He lost the snake within the reeds, but he came upon something else, a canoe hidden there close to the bank. He examined it with cackling laughter. There were 2 paddles within it, which he took and threw out into the current of the river. He watched them for a while, and then he sat down beside the canoe and commenced to splash his hands up and down upon the water. He liked to hear the noise and see the little splashes of spray. He rubbed his left forearm with his right palm, and the dirt came off and left a white spot that drew his attention. He rubbed again upon the now thoroughly soaked blood and grime that covered his body. He was not attempting to wash himself, he was merely amused by the strange results. "I am turning white," he cried. His glance wandered from his body now that the grime and blood were all removed, and caught again the white city shimmering beneath the hot sun. "Allure, city of light," he shrieked, and that reminded him again of Chulur, and by the same process of associated ideas that had before suggested it, he recalled that the Waz Hodan had thought him Jad Ben Otho. "I am Jad Ben Otho," he screamed, and then his eyes fell again upon the canoe. A new idea came and persisted. He looked down at himself, examining his body, and seeing the filthy loincloth, now water-soaked and more bedraggled than before, he tore it from him and flung it into the lake. "Gods do not wear dirty rags," he said aloud. "They do not wear anything but wreaths and garlands of flowers, and I am a god. I am Jad Ben Otho, and I go in state to my sacred city of Allure." He ran his fingers through his matted hair and beard. The water had softened the burrs but had not removed them. The man shook his head. His hair and beard failed to harmonize with his other godly attributes. He was commencing to think more clearly now, for the great idea had taken hold of his scattered wits and concentrated them upon a single purpose, but he was still a maniac, the only difference being that he was now a maniac with a fixed intent. He went out on the shore and gathered flowers and ferns and wove them in his beard and hair, blazing blooms of different colors, green ferns that trailed about his ears or rose bravely upward like the plumes in a lady's hat. When he was satisfied that his appearance would impress the most casual observer with his evident deity, he returned to the canoe, pushed it from shore, and jumped in. The impetus carried it into the river's current, and the current bore it out upon the lake. The naked man stood erect in the center of the little craft, his arms folded upon his chest. He screamed aloud his message to the city: "I am Jad Ben Otho. Let the high priest and the under-priests attend upon me." As the current of the river was dissipated by the waters of the lake, the wind caught him and his craft and carried them bravely forward. Sometimes he drifted with his back toward Allure, and sometimes with his face toward it, and at intervals he shrieked his message and his commands. He was still in the middle of the lake when someone discovered him from the palace wall, and as he drew nearer, a crowd of warriors and women and children were congregated there watching him, and along the temple walls were many priests, and among them Ludon, the high priest. When the boat had drifted close enough for them to distinguish the bizarre figure standing in it, and for them to catch the meaning of his words, Ludon's cunning eyes narrowed. The high priest had learned of the escape of Tarzan, and he feared that should he join Jad Don's forces, as seemed likely, he would attract many recruits who might still believe in him, and the Dorul Otho, even if a false one, upon the side of the enemy might easily work havoc with Ludon's plans. The man was drifting close in. His canoe would soon be caught in the current that ran close to shore here and carried toward the river that emptied the waters of Jad Ben Lul into Jad Bal Lul. The under-priests were looking toward Ludon for instructions. "Fetch him hither," he commanded. "If he is Jad Ben Otho, I shall know him." The priests hurried to the palace grounds and summoned warriors. "Go, bring the stranger to Ludon. If he is Jad Ben Otho, we shall know him." And so Lieutenant Erich Obergatz was brought before the high priest at Allure. Ludon looked closely at the naked man with the fantastic headdress. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "I am Jad Ben Otho," cried the German. "I came from heaven. Where is my high priest?" "I am the high priest," replied Ludon. Obergatz clapped his hands. "Have my feet bathed and food brought to me," he commanded. Ludon's eyes narrowed to mere slits of crafty cunning. He bowed low until his forehead touched the feet of the stranger. Before the eyes of many priests and warriors from the palace he did it. "Ho, slaves," he cried, "rising fetch water and food for the great god." And thus the high priest acknowledged before his people the godhood of Lieutenant Ericho Burroughs, nor was it long before the story ran like wildfire through the palace and out into the city and beyond that to the lesser villages all the way from Allur to Tulur. The real god had come Jad Ben Otho himself, and he had espoused the cause of Ludon, the high priest. Mosar lost no time in placing himself at the disposal of Ludon, nor did he mention aught about his claims to the throne. It was Mosar's opinion that he might consider himself fortunate were he allowed to remain in peaceful occupation of his chieftainship at Tulur, nor was Mosar wrong in his deductions. But Ludon could still use him, and so he let him live and sent word to him to come to Allur with all his warriors, for it was rumored that Jadon was raising a great army in the north and might soon march upon the City of Light. Obergatz thoroughly enjoyed being a god. Plenty of food and peace of mind and rest partially brought back to him the reason that had been so rapidly slipping from him, but in one respect he was madder than ever, since now no power on earth would ever be able to convince him that he was not a god. Slaves were put at his disposal, and these he ordered about in godly fashion. The same portion of his naturally cruel mind met upon common ground the mind of Ludon, so that the two seemed always in accord. The high priest saw in the stranger a mighty force wherewith to hold forever his power over all Palal Dawn, and thus the future of Obergatz was assured so long as he cared to play god to Ludon's high priest. A throne was erected in the main temple court before the eastern altar where Jad Ben Otho might sit in person and behold the sacrifices that were offered up to him there each day at sunset. So much did the cruel, half-crazed mind enjoy these spectacles that at times he even insisted upon wielding the sacrificial knife himself, and upon such occasions the priests and the people fell upon their faces in awe of the dread deity. If Obergatz taught them not to love their god more, he taught them to fear him as they never had before, so that the name of Jad Ben Otho was whispered in the city and little children were frightened into obedience by the mere mention of it. Ludon, through his priests and slaves, circulated the information that Jad Ben Otho had commanded all his faithful followers to flock to the standard of the high priest at Allur, and that all others were cursed, especially Jadon and the base impostor who had posed as the Dor Olotho. The curse was to take the form of early death, following terrible suffering, and Ludon caused it to be published abroad that the name of any warrior who complained of a pain should be brought to him, for such might be deemed to be under suspicion. Since the first effects of the curse would result in slight pains attacking the unholy, he counseled those who felt pains to look carefully to their loyalty. The result was remarkable and immediate: half a nation without a pain, and recruits pouring into Allur to offer their services to Ludon while secretly hoping that the little pains they had felt in arm or leg or belly would not recur in aggravated form. Chapter 22. A Journey on a Greif. Tarzan and Jane skirted the shore of Jadbal Lul and crossed the river at the head of the lake. They moved in leisurely fashion with an eye to comfort and safety, for the ape-man, now that he had found his mate, was determined to court no chance that might again separate them, or delay or prevent their escape from Palul Dawn. How they were to recross the morass was a matter of little concern to him as yet. It would be time enough to consider that matter when it became of more immediate moment. Their hours were filled with the happiness and content of reunion. After long separation they had much to talk of, for each had passed through many trials and vicissitudes and strange adventures, and no important hour might go unaccounted for since last they met. It was Tarzan's intention to choose a way above Allur and the scattered Hodon villages below it, passing about midway between them and the mountains, thus avoiding in so far as possible both the Hodon and Wazdon, for in this area lay the neutral territory that was uninhabited by either. Thus he would travel northwest until opposite the Khor ul-Jah, where he planned to stop to pay his respects to Amat and give the gunned word of Pan at Lee, and a plan Tarzan had for ensuring her safe return to her people. It was upon the third day of their journey, and they had almost reached the river that passes through Allur, when Jane suddenly clutched Tarzan's arm and pointed ahead toward the edge of a forest that they were approaching. Beneath the shadows of the trees loomed a great bulk that the ape-man instantly recognized. "What is it?" whispered Jane. "Edgar," replied the ape-man, "and we have met him in the worst place that we could possibly have found. There is not a large tree within a quarter of a mile, other than those among which he stands. Come, we shall have to go back, Jane. I cannot risk it with you along. The best we can do is to pray that he does not discover us. And if he does, then I shall have to risk it. Risk what? The chance that I can subdue him as I subdued one of his fellows, replied Tarzan. I told you, you recall? Yes, but I did not picture so huge a creature. Why, John, he is as big as a battleship. The ape-man laughed. Not quite, though I'll admit he looks quite as formidable as one when he charges. They were moving away slowly so as not to attract the attention of the beast. I believe we're going to make it, whispered the woman, her voice tense with suppressed excitement. A low rumble rolled like distant thunder from the wood. Tarzan shook his head. The big show is about to commence in the main tent, he quoted, grinning. He caught the woman suddenly to his breast and kissed her. One can never tell, Jane, he said. We'll do our best, that is all we can do. Give me your spear and don't run. The only hope we have lies in that little brain more than in us. If I can control it well, let us see. The beast had emerged from the forest and was looking about through his weak eyes, evidently in search of them. Tarzan raised his voice in the weird notes of the Toro Don's cry, wee-oo, 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 wee. For a moment, the great beast stood motionless, his attention riveted by the call. The ape-man advanced straight toward him, Jane Clayton at his elbow. Wee-oo, he cried again peremptorily. A low rumble rolled from the Graf's cavernous chest in answer to the call, and the beast moved slowly toward them. Fine, exclaimed Tarzan. The odds are in our favor now. You can keep your nerve, but I do not need to ask. I know no fear when I am with Tarzan of the Apes, she replied softly, and he felt the pressure of her soft fingers on his arm. And thus the two approached the giant monster of a forgotten epoch, until they stood close in the shadow of a mighty shoulder. Wee-oo, shouted Tarzan, and struck the hideous snout with the shaft of the spear. The vicious side snap that did not reach its mark, that evidently was not intended to reach its mark, was the hoped-for answer. Come, said Tarzan, and taking Jane by the hand he led her round behind the monster and up the broad tail to the great horn back. Now will we ride in the state that our forebears knew, before which the pomp of modern kings pales into cheap and tawdry insignificance? How would you like to canter through Hyde Park on a mount like this? I am afraid the bobbies would be shocked by our riding habits, John, she cried laughingly. Tarzan guided the Grafe in the direction that they wished to go. Steep embankments and rivers proved no slightest obstacle to the ponderous creature. A prehistoric tank, this Jane assured him, and laughing and talking they continued on their way. Once they came unexpectedly upon a dozen Hodon warriors, as the Grafe emerged suddenly into a small clearing. The fellows were lying about in the shade of a single tree that grew alone. When they saw the beast they leaped to their feet in consternation, and at their shouts the Grafe issued his hideous, challenging bellow and charged them. The warriors fled in all directions while Tarzan belabored the beast across the snout with his spear in an effort to control him, and at last he succeeded just as the Grafe was almost upon one poor devil that it seemed to have singled out for its special prey. With an angry grunt the Grafe stopped, and the man, with a single backward glance that showed a face white with terror, disappeared in the jungle he had been seeking to reach. The ape-man was elated. He had doubted that he could control the beast should it take it into its head to charge a victim, and had intended abandoning it before they reached the Coral J. Now he altered his plans. They would ride to the very village of Almat upon the Grafe, and the Coral J would have food for conversation for many generations to come. Nor was it the theatric instinct of the ape-man alone that gave favor to this plan. The element of Jane's safety entered into the matter, for he knew that she would be safe from man and beast alike so long as she rode upon the back of Palaludon's most formidable creature. As they proceeded slowly in the direction of the Coral Jah, for the natural gait of the Grafe is far from rapid, a handful of terrified warriors came panting into a lure, spreading a weird story of the Doro Oloto, only none dared call him the Doro Olodo loud. Instead they spoke of him as Tarzan Jadguru, and they told of meeting him mounted upon a mighty Grafe beside the beautiful stranger woman whom Khotan would have made queen of Palaludon. This story was brought to Ludon, who caused the warriors to be hailed to his presence when he questioned them closely until finally he was convinced that they spoke the truth, and when they had told him the direction in which the two were traveling. Ludon guessed that they were on their way to Jalur to join Jadon, a contingency that he felt must be prevented at any cost. As was his wont in the stress of emergency, he called Pan Sat into consultation, and for long the two sat in close conference. When they arose, a plan had been developed. Pan Sat went immediately to his own quarters, where he removed the headdress and trappings of a priest to don in their stead the harness and weapons of a warrior. Then he returned to Loudon. "Good," cried the latter when he saw him. "Not even your fellow priests or the slaves that wait upon you daily would know you now. Lose no time, Pan Sat, for all depends upon the speed with which you strike, and remember, kill the man if you can, but in any event bring the woman to me here alive, you understand?" "Yes, master," replied the priest. And so it was that a lone warrior set out from Allur and made his way northwest in the direction of Jalur. The gorge next above Korul Jai is uninhabited, and here the wily Jaidon had chosen to mobilize his army for its descent upon Allur. Two considerations influenced him, one being the fact that could he keep his plans a secret from the enemy, he would have the advantage of delivering a surprise attack upon the forces of Loudon from a direction that they would not expect attack. And in the meantime he would be able to keep his men from the gossip of the cities, where strange tales were already circulating relative to the coming of Jad Ben Otho in person to aid the high priest in his war against Jadon. It took stout hearts and loyal ones to ignore the implied threats of divine vengeance that these tales suggested. Already there had been desertions, and the cause of Jadon seemed tottering to destruction. Such was the state of affairs when a sentry posted on the knoll in the mouth of the gorge sent word that he had observed in the valley below what appeared at a distance to be nothing less than two people mounted upon the back of a gryph. He said that he had caught glimpses of them as they passed open spaces, and they seemed to be traveling up the river in the direction of the Korulya. At first Jadon was inclined to doubt the veracity of his informant, but, like all good generals, he could not permit even palpably false information to go uninvestigated, and so he determined to visit the knoll himself and learn precisely what it was that the sentry had observed through the distorting spectacles of fear. He had scarce taken his place beside the man ere the fellow touched his arm and pointed. "They are closer now," he whispered. "You can see them plainly." And sure enough, not a quarter of a mile away, Jadon saw that which in his long experience in Palildon he had never before seen: two humans riding upon the broad back of a gryph. At first he could scarce credit even this testimony of his own eyes, but soon he realized that the creatures below could be naught else than they appeared, and then he recognized the man and rose to his feet with a loud cry. "It is he shouted to those about him. "It is the Dor Ulotho himself." The gryph and his riders heard the shout, though not the words. The former bellowed terrifically and started in the direction of the knoll, and Jadon, followed by a few of his more intrepid warriors, ran to meet him. Tarzan, loath to enter an unnecessary quarrel, tried to turn the animal, but as the beast was far from tractable, it always took a few minutes to force the will of its master upon it. And so the two parties were quite close before the ape-man succeeded in stopping the mad charge of his furious mount. Jadon and his warriors, however, had come to the realization that this bellowing creature was bearing down upon them with evil intent, and they had assumed the better part of valor and taken to trees, accordingly. It was beneath these trees that Tarzan finally stopped the gryph. Jadon called down to him. "We are friends," he cried. "I am Jadon, chief of Jalur. I and my warriors lay our foreheads upon the feet of Doroloto and pray that he will aid us in our righteous fight with Loudon, the high priest." "You have not defeated him yet?" asked Tarzan. "Why, I thought you would be king of Palildon long before this." "No," replied Jadon. "The people fear the high priest, and now that he has in the temple one whom he claims to be Jad Ben Otho, many of my warriors are afraid. If they but knew that the Dor al-Otho had returned, and that he had blessed the cause of Jadon, I am sure that victory would be ours." Tarzan thought for a long minute, and then he spoke. "Jadon," he said, "was one of the few who believed in me and who wished to accord me fair treatment. I have a debt to pay to Jadon and an account to settle with Loudon, not alone on my own behalf, but principally upon that of my mate. I will go with you, Jadon, to meet to Loudon the punishment he deserves. Tell me, chief, how may the Dor Ulotho best serve his father's people?" "By coming with me to Jalur and the villages between," replied Jadon quickly, "that the people may see that it is indeed the Dor Ulotho and that he smiles upon the cause of Jadon." "You think that they will believe in me more now than before?" asked the ape-man. "Who will dare doubt that he who rides upon the great gryph is less than a god?" returned the old chief. "And if I go with you to the battle at Allur," asked Tarzan, "can you assure the safety of my mate while I am gone from her?" "She shall remain in Jalur with the Princess Oloe and my own women," replied Jadon. "There she will be safe, for there I shall leave trusted warriors to protect them. Say that you will come, O Doro Uloto, and my cup of happiness will be full, for even now Taden, my son, marches toward Allur with a force from the northwest, and if we can attack, with the Doro Uloto at our head, from the northeast our arms should be victorious." "It shall be as you wish, Jadon," replied the ape-man, "but first you must have meat fetched for my grife." "There are many carcasses in the camp above," replied Jadon, "for my men have little else to do than hunt." "Good," exclaimed Tarzan. "Have them brought at once." And when the meat was brought and laid at a distance, the ape-man slipped from the back of his fierce charger and fed him with his own hand. "See that there is always plenty of flesh for him," he said to Jadon, for he guessed that his mastery might be short-lived should the vicious beast become over-hungry. It was morning before they could leave for Jalur, but Tarzan found the grief lying where he had left him the night before beside the carcasses of 2 antelope and a lion, but now there was nothing but the grief. "The paleontologists say that he was herbivorous," said Tarzan as he and Jane approached the beast. The journey to Jalur was made through the scattered villages where Jadon hoped to arouse a keener enthusiasm for his cause. A party of warriors preceded Tarzan that the people might properly be prepared not only for the sight of the Grafe but to receive the Doriula-O, though as became his high station. The results were all that Jadon could have hoped, and in no village through which they passed was there one who doubted the deity of the ape-man. As they approached Jalur, a strange warrior joined them, one whom none of Jadon's following knew. He said he came from one of the villages to the south, and that he had been treated unfairly by one of Ludon's chiefs. For this reason he had deserted the cause of the high priest and come north in the hope of finding a home in Jalur. As every addition to his forces was welcome to the old chief, he permitted the stranger to accompany them, and so he came into Jalur with them. There arose now the question as to what was to be done with the Grafe while they remained in the city. It was with difficulty that Tarzan had prevented the savage beast from attacking all who came near it when they had first entered the camp of Jadon in the uninhabited gorge next to the Korul Jay. But during the march to Jalur, the creature had seemed to become accustomed to the presence of the Hodan. The latter, however, gave him no cause for annoyance, since they kept as far from him as possible, and when he passed through the streets of the city he was viewed from the safety of lofty windows and roofs. However tractable he appeared to have become, there would have been no enthusiastic seconding of a suggestion to turn him loose within the city. It was finally suggested that he be turned into a walled enclosure within the palace grounds, and this was done, Tarzan driving him in after Jane had dismounted. More meat was thrown to him and he was left to his own devices, the awe-struck inhabitants of the palace not even venturing to climb upon the walls to look at him. Jadon led Tarzan and Jane to the quarters of the Princess Oloa, who, the moment that she beheld the ape-man, threw herself to the ground and touched her forehead to his feet. Panatli was there with her, and she too seemed happy to see Tarzan Jadguru again. When they found that Jane was his mate, they looked with almost equal awe upon her, since even the most skeptical of the warriors of Jadon were now convinced that they were entertaining a god and a goddess within the city of Jalur, and that, with the assistance of the power of these two, the cause of Jadon would soon be victorious and the old lion man set upon the throne of Palildon. From Oloa, Tarzan learned that Ta-Den had returned and that they were to be united in marriage with the weird rites of their religion and in accordance with the custom of their people as soon as Ta-Den came home from the battle that was to be fought at Allur. The recruits were now gathering at the city, and it was decided that the next day Jadon and Tarzan would return to the main body in the hidden camp, and immediately under cover of night the attack should be made in force upon Ludon's forces at Allur. Word of this was sent to Ta-Den, where he awaited with his warriors upon the north side of Jad Ben Lul, only a few miles from Allur. In the carrying out of these plans it was necessary to leave Jane behind in Jadon's palace at Jalur, but Oloa and her women were with her and there were many warriors to guard them, so Tarzan bid his mate goodbye with no feelings of apprehension as to her safety. And again, seated upon the Grafe, made his way out of the city with Jadon and his warriors. At the mouth of the gorge, the ape-man abandoned his huge mount, since it had served its purpose, and could be of no further value to him in their attack upon Allur, which was to be made just before dawn the following day, when as he could not have been seen by the enemy. The effect of his entry to the city upon the Grafe would have been totally lost. A couple of sharp blows with the spear sent the big animal rumbling and growling in the direction of the Korul Grafe, nor was the ape-man sorry to see it depart, since he had never known at what instant its short temper and insatiable appetite for flesh might turn it upon some of his companions. Immediately upon their arrival at the gorge, the march on Allur was commenced. Chapter 23. Taken alive. As night fell, a warrior from the palace of Allur slipped into the temple grounds. He made his way to where the lesser priests were quartered. His presence aroused no suspicion, as it was not unusual for warriors to have business within the temple. He came at last to a chamber where several priests were congregated after the evening meal. The rites and ceremonies of the sacrifice had been concluded, and there was nothing more of a religious nature to make call upon their time until the rites at sunrise. Now the warrior knew, as in fact nearly all Pal-ul-Don knew, that there was no strong bond between the temple and the palace at Allur, and that Don only suffered the presence of the priests and permitted their cruel and abhorrent acts because of the fact that these things had been the custom of the Hodon of Pal-ul-Don for countless ages. And rash indeed must have been the man who would have attempted to interfere with the priests or their ceremonies. That Don never entered the temple was well known, and that his high priest never entered the palace. But the people came to the temple with their votive offerings, and the sacrifices were made night and morning, as in every other temple in Pal-ul-Don. The warriors knew these things, knew them better perhaps than a simple warrior should have known them, and so it was here in the temple that he looked for the aid that he sought in the carrying out of whatever design he had. As he entered the apartment where the priests were, he greeted them after the manner which was customary in Pal-ul-Don, but at the same time he made a sign with his finger that might have attracted little attention or scarcely been noticed at all by one who knew not its meaning. That there were those within the room who noticed it and interpreted it was quickly apparent through the fact that two of the priests rose and came close to him as he stood just within the doorway, and each of them, as he came, returned the signal that the warrior had made. The three talked for but a moment, and then the warrior turned and left the apartment. A little later, one of the priests who had talked with him left also, and shortly after that the other. In the corridor they found the warrior waiting, and led him to a little chamber which opened upon a smaller corridor just beyond where it joined the larger. Here the three remained in whispered conversation for some little time, and then the warrior returned to the palace and the two priests to their quarters. The apartments of the women of the palace at Allur are all upon the same side of a long, straight corridor. Each has a single door leading into the corridor, and at the opposite end several windows overlooking a garden. It was in one of these rooms that Jane slept alone. At each end of the corridor was a sentinel, the main body of the guard being stationed in a room near the outer entrance to the women's quarters. The palace slept, for they kept early hours there where Don ruled. The Pali-Don So of the great chieftain of the north knew no such wild orgies as had resounded through the palace of the king at Allur. Allur was a quiet city by comparison with the capital, yet there was always a guard kept at every entrance to the chambers of Don and his immediate family, as well as at the gate leading into the temple, and that which opened upon the city. These guards, however, were small, consisting usually of not more than 5 or 6 warriors, one of whom remained awake while the others slept. Such were the conditions then when 2 warriors presented themselves, one at either end of the corridor, to the sentries who watched over the safety of Jane Clayton and the Princess Oloe. And each of the newcomers repeated to the sentinels the stereotyped words which announced that they were relieved and these others sent to watch in their stead. Never is a warrior loath to be relieved of sentry duty, where, under different circumstances, he might ask numerous questions. He is now too well satisfied to escape the monotonies of that universally hated duty. And so these 2 men accepted their relief without question and hastened away to their pallets. And then a 3rd warrior entered the corridor, and all of the newcomers came together before the door of the ape-man's slumbering mate. And one was the strange warrior who had met Don and Tarzan outside the city of Allur as they had approached it the previous day, and he was the same warrior who had entered the temple a short hour before, but the faces of his fellows were unfamiliar, even to one another, since it is seldom that a priest removes his hideous headdress in the presence even of his associates. Silently they lifted the hangings that hid the interior of the room from the view of those who passed through the corridor and stealthily slunk within. Upon a pile of furs in a far corner lay the sleeping form of Lady Greystoke. The bare feet of the intruders gave forth no sound as they crossed the stone floor toward her. A ray of moonlight entering through a window near her couch shone full upon her, revealing the beautiful contours of an arm and shoulder in cameo distinctness against the dark furry pelt beneath which she slept, and the perfect profile that was turned toward the skulking 3. But neither the beauty nor the helplessness of the sleeper aroused such sentiments of passion or pity as might stir in the breasts of normal men. To the three priests she was but a lump of clay, nor could they conceive aught of that passion which had aroused men to intrigue and to murder for possession of this beautiful American girl, and which even now was influencing the destiny of undiscovered Pal Uldan. Upon the floor of the chamber were numerous pelts, and as the leader of the trio came close to the sleeping woman, he stooped and gathered up one of the smaller of these. Standing close to her head, he held the rug outspread above her face. Now he whispered, and simultaneously he threw the rug over the woman's head, and his two fellows leaped upon her, seizing her arms and pinioning her body while their leader stifled her cries with the furry pelt. Quickly and silently they bound her wrists and gagged her, and during the brief time that their work required there was no sound that might have been heard by occupants of the adjoining apartments. Jerking her roughly to her feet, they forced her toward a window, but she refused to walk, throwing herself instead upon the floor. They were very angry and would have resorted to cruelties to compel her obedience, but dared not, since the wrath of Ludon might fall heavily upon whoever mutilated his fair prize. And so they were forced to lift and carry her bodily. Nor was the task any sinecure, since the captive kicked and struggled as best she might, making their labor as arduous as possible. But finally they succeeded in getting her through the window and into the garden beyond, where one of the two priests from the Jailur temple directed their steps toward a small barred gateway in the south wall of the enclosure. Immediately beyond this, a flight of stone stairs led downward toward the river, and at the foot of the stairs were moored several canoes. Pansat had indeed been fortunate in enlisting aid from those who knew the temple and the palace so well, or otherwise he might never have escaped from Jailur with his captive. Placing the woman in the bottom of a light canoe, Pansat entered it and took up the paddle. His companions unfastened the moorings and shoved the little craft out into the current of the stream. Their traitorous work completed, they turned and retraced their steps toward the temple, while Pansat, paddling strongly with the current, moved rapidly down the river that would carry him to the Jad Ben Lul and Allur. The moon had set, and the eastern horizon still gave no hint of approaching day, as a long file of warriors wound stealthily through the darkness into the city of Allur. Their plans were all laid, and there seemed no likelihood of their miscarriage. A messenger had been dispatched to Ta Den, whose forces lay northwest of the city. Tarzan, with a small contingent, was to enter the temple through the secret passageway, the location of which he alone knew, while Ja Don, with the greater proportion of the warriors, was to attack the palace gates. The ape-man, leading his little band, moved stealthily through the winding alleys of Allur, arriving undetected at the building which hid the entrance to the secret passageway. This spot, being best protected by the fact that its existence was unknown to others than the priests, was unguarded. To facilitate the passage of his little company through the narrow, winding, uneven tunnel, Tarzan lighted a torch which had been brought for the purpose, and preceding his warriors led the way toward the temple. That he could accomplish much once he reached the inner chambers of the temple with his little band of picked warriors, the ape-man was confident, since an attack at this point would bring confusion and consternation to the easily overpowered priests, and permit Tarzan to attack the palace forces in the rear at the same time that Ja Don engaged them at the palace gates, while Ta Den and his forces swarmed the northern walls. Great value had been placed by Ja Don on the moral effect of the door or those mysterious appearance in the heart of the temple, and he had urged Tarzan to take every advantage of the old chieftain's belief that many of Ludon's warriors still wavered in their allegiance between the high priest and the door Iuolotho, being held to the former more by the fear which he engendered in the breasts of all his followers than by any love or loyalty they might feel toward him. There is a Pal Uldonian proverb setting forth a truth similar to that contained in the old Scotch adage that the best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after. Gley freely translated it might read, "He who follows the right trail sometimes reaches the wrong destination." And such apparently was the fate that lay in the footsteps of the great chieftain of the north and his godlike ally. Tarzan, more familiar with the windings of the corridors than his fellows, and having the advantage of the full light of the torch, which at best was but a dim and flickering affair, was some distance ahead of the others. And in his keen anxiety to close with the enemy, he gave too little thought to those who were to support him. Nor is this strange, since from childhood the ape-man had been accustomed to fight the battles of life single-handed, so that it had become habitual for him to depend solely upon his own cunning and prowess. And so it was that he came into the upper corridor from which opened the chambers of Ludon and the lesser priests far in advance of his warriors, and as he turned into this corridor with its dim cressets flickering somberly, he saw another enter it from a corridor before him, a warrior half carrying, half dragging the figure of a woman. Instantly Tarzan recognized the gagged and fettered captive whom he had thought safe in the palace of Jardon at Jalur. The warrior with the woman had seen Tarzan at the same instant that the latter had discovered him. He heard the low beast-like growl that broke from the ape-man's lips as he sprang forward to wrest his mate from her captor and wreak upon him the vengeance that was in the Tarmangani's savage heart. Across the corridor from Pan Sat was the entrance to a smaller chamber. Into this he leaped, carrying the woman with him. Close behind came Tarzan of the Apes. He had cast aside his torch and drawn the long knife that had been his father's. With the impetuosity of a charging bull, he rushed into the chamber in pursuit of Pan Sat to find himself, when the hangings dropped behind him, in utter darkness. Almost immediately there was a crash of stone on stone before him, followed a moment later by a similar crash behind. No other evidence was necessary to announce to the ape-man that he was again a prisoner in Lu Don's temple. He stood perfectly still where he had halted at the first sound of the descending stone door. Not again would he easily be precipitated to the Gref pit, or some similar danger as had occurred when Lu Don had trapped him in the temple of the Gref. As he stood there, his eyes slowly grew accustomed to the darkness, and he became aware that a dim light was entering the chamber through some opening, though it was several minutes before he discovered its source. In the roof of the chamber he finally discerned a small aperture, possibly 3 feet in diameter, and it was through this that what was really only a lesser darkness, rather than a light, was penetrating its Stygian blackness of the chamber in which he was imprisoned. Since the doors had fallen he had heard no sound, though his keen ears were constantly strained in an effort to discover a clue to the direction taken by the abductor of his mate. Presently he could discern the outlines of his prison cell. It was a small room, not over 15 feet across. On hands and knees, with the utmost caution, he examined the entire area of the floor. In the exact center, directly beneath the opening in the roof, was a trap, but otherwise the floor was solid. With this knowledge, it was only necessary to avoid this spot insofar as the floor was concerned. The walls next received his attention. There were only 2 openings, one the doorway through which he had entered, and upon the opposite side that through which the warrior had borne Jane Clayton. These were both closed by the slabs of stone which the fleeing warrior had released as he departed. Lu Don, the high priest, licked his thin lips and rubbed his bony white hands together in gratification as Pan Sat bore Jane Clayton into his presence and laid her on the floor of the chamber before him. "Good Pan Sat," he exclaimed, "you shall be well rewarded for this service. Now, if we but had the false Dorioloto in our power, all Paul Don would be at our feet." "Master, I have him," cried Pan Sat. "What?" exclaimed Lu Don. "You have Tarzan Jadguru, you have slain him perhaps. Tell me, my wonderful Pan Sat, tell me quickly. My breast is bursting with a desire to know." "I have taken him alive, Lu Don, my master," replied Pan Sat. "He is in the little chamber that the ancients built to trap those who were too powerful to take alive in personal encounter." "You have done well, Pan Sat. A frightened priest burst into the apartment. "Quick, master, quick," he cried. "The corridors are filled with the warriors of Jardon." "You are mad," cried the high priest. "My warriors hold the palace and the temple." "I speak the truth, master," replied the priest. "There are warriors in the corridor approaching this very chamber, and they come from the direction of the secret passage which leads hither from the city." "It may be even as he says," exclaimed Pan Sat. "It was from that direction that Tarzan Jadguru was coming when I discovered and trapped him. He was leading his warriors to the very holy of holies." Lu Don ran quickly to the doorway and looked out into the corridor. At a glance he saw that the fears of the frightened priest were well founded. A dozen warriors were moving along the corridor toward him, but they seemed confused and far from sure of themselves. The high priest guessed that, deprived of the leadership of Tarzan, they were little better than lost in the unknown mazes of the subterranean precincts of the temple. Stepping back into the apartment, he seized a leathern thong that depended from the ceiling. He pulled upon it sharply, and through the temple boomed the deep tones of a metal gong. 5 times the clanging notes rang through the corridors. Then he turned toward the 2 priests. "Bring the woman and follow me," he directed. Crossing the chamber, he passed through a small doorway, the others lifting Jane Clayton from the floor and following him. Through a narrow corridor and up a flight of steps they went. turning to right and left and doubling back through a maze of winding passageways which terminated in a spiral staircase that gave forth at the surface of the ground within the largest of the inner altar courts, close beside the eastern altar. From all directions now, in the corridors below and the grounds above, came the sound of hurrying footsteps. The 5 strokes of the great gong had summoned the faithful to the defense of Loudon in his private chambers. The priests who knew the way led the less familiar warriors to the spot, and presently those who had accompanied Tarzan found themselves not only leaderless but facing a vastly superior force. They were brave men, but under the circumstances they were helpless, and so they fell back the way they had come, and when they reached the narrow confines of the smaller passageway their safety was assured, since only one foeman could attack them at a time. But their plans were frustrated and possibly also their entire cause lost, so heavily had Jadon banked upon the success of their venture. With the clanging of the temple gong, Jadon assumed that Tarzan and his party had struck their initial blow, and so he launched his attack upon the palace gate. To the ears of Loudon in the inner temple court came the savage war cries that announced the beginning of the battle. Leaving Pan Sat and the other priest to guard the woman, he hastened toward the palace personally to direct his force, and as he passed through the temple grounds he dispatched a messenger to learn the outcome of the fight in the corridors below, and other messengers to spread the news among his followers that the false Dorolotho was a prisoner in the temple. As the din of battle rose above Allure, Lieutenant Erich Obergatz turned upon his bed of soft hides and sat up. He rubbed his eyes and looked about him. It was still dark without. "I am Jad Ben Otho," he cried, "who dares disturb my slumber?" A slave squatting upon the floor at the foot of his couch shuddered and touched her forehead to the floor. "It must be that the enemy have come, O Jad Ben Otho," she spoke soothingly, for she had reason to know the terrors of the mad frenzy into which trivial things sometimes threw the great god. A priest burst suddenly through the hangings of the doorway and, falling upon his hands and knees, rubbed his forehead against the stone flagging. "O Jad Ben Otho," he cried, "the warriors of Jadon have attacked the palace and the temple. Even now they are fighting in the corridors near the quarters of Loudon, and the high priest begs that you come to the palace and encourage your faithful warriors by your presence." Obergatz sprang to his feet. "I am Jad Ben Otho," he screamed. "With lightning I will blast the blasphemers who dare attack the holy city of Allure." For a moment he rushed aimlessly and madly about the room, while the priest and the slave remained upon hands and knees with their foreheads against the floor. "Come," cried Obergatz, planting a vicious kick in the side of the slave girl. "Come. Would you wait here all day while the forces of darkness overwhelm the city of light?" Thoroughly frightened, as were all those who were forced to serve the great god, the two arose and followed Obergatz towards the palace. Above the shouting of the warriors rose constantly the cries of the temple priests. "Jad Ben Otho is here, and the false Doru Olto is a prisoner in the temple." The persistent cries reached even to the ears of the enemy, as it was intended that they should. Chapter 24. The Messenger of Death. The sun rose to see the forces of Jadon still held at the palace gate. The old warrior had seized the tall structure that stood just beyond the palace, and at the summit of this he kept a warrior stationed to look toward the northern wall of the palace, where Tadaden was to make his attack. But as the minutes wore into hours, no sign of the other force appeared. And now, in the full light of the new sun, upon the roof of one of the palace buildings appeared Loudon, the high priest Mosar, the pretender, and the strange naked figure of a man, into whose long hair and beard were woven fresh ferns and flowers. Behind them were banked a score of lesser priests who chanted in unison, "This is Jad Ben Otho. Lay down your arms and surrender." This they repeated again and again, alternating it with the cry, "The false Dorolotho is a prisoner." In one of those lulls which are common in battles between forces armed with weapons that require great physical effort in their use, a voice suddenly arose from among the followers of Jadon, "Show us the Dorolotho. We do not believe you." "Wait," cried Loudon. "If I do not produce him before the sun has moved his own width, the gates of the palace shall be opened to you, and my warriors will lay down their arms." He turned to one of his priests and issued brief instructions. The ape-man paced the confines of his narrow cell. Bitterly he reproached himself for the stupidity which had led him into this trap, and yet was it stupidity? What else might he have done other than rush to the succor of his mate? He wondered how they had stolen her from Jalur, and then suddenly there flashed to his mind the features of the warrior whom he had just seen with her. They were strangely familiar. He racked his brain to recall where he had seen the man before, and then it came to him. He was the strange warrior who had joined Jadon's forces outside of Jalur the day that Tarzan had ridden upon the great Gref from the uninhabited gorge next to the Khor il-Jah down to the capital city of the chieftain of the north. But who could the man be? Tarzan knew that never before that other day had he seen him. Presently he heard the clanging of a gong from the corridor without, and very faintly the rush of feet and shouts. He guessed that his warriors had been discovered and a fight was in progress. He fretted and chafed at the chance that had denied him participation in it. Again and again he tried the doors of his prison and the trap in the center of the floor, but none would give to his utmost endeavors. He strained his eyes toward the aperture above, but he could see nothing, and then he continued his futile pacing to and fro like a caged lion behind its bars. The minutes dragged slowly into hours. Faintly sounds came to him as of shouting men at a great distance. The battle was in progress. He wondered if Jadon would be victorious, and should he be, would his friends ever discover him in this hidden chamber in the bowels of the hill? He doubted it. And now as he looked again toward the aperture in the roof, there appeared to be something depending through its center. He came closer and strained his eyes to see. Yes, there was something there. It appeared to be a rope. Tarzan wondered if it had been there all the time. It must have, he reasoned, since he had heard no sound from above, and it was so dark within the chamber that he might easily have overlooked it. He raised his hand toward it. The end of it was just within his reach. He bore his weight upon it to see if it would hold him. Then he released it and backed away, still watching it, as you have seen an animal do after investigating some unfamiliar object, one of the little traits that differentiated Tarzan from other men, accentuating his similarity to the savage beasts of his native jungle. Again and again he touched and tested the braided leather rope, and always he listened for any warning sound from above. He was very careful not to step upon the trap at any time, and when finally he bore all his weight upon the rope and took his feet from the floor, he spread them wide apart so that if he fell he would fall astride the trap. The rope held him. There was no sound from above nor any from the trap below. Slowly and cautiously he drew himself upward, hand over hand. Nearer and nearer the roof he came. In a moment his eyes would be above the level of the floor above. Already his extended arms projected into the upper chamber, and then something closed suddenly upon both his forearms, pinioning them tightly and leaving him hanging in mid-air, unable to advance or retreat. Immediately a light appeared in the room above him, and presently he saw the hideous mask of a priest peering down upon him. In the priest's hands were leathern thongs, and these he tied about Tarzan's wrists and forearms until they were completely bound together from his elbows almost to his fingers. Behind this priest Tarzan presently saw others, and soon several lay hold of him and pulled him up through the hole. Almost instantly his eyes were above the level of the floor. He understood how they had trapped him. 2 nooses had lain encircling the aperture into the cell below. A priest had waited at the end of each of these ropes, and at opposite sides of the chamber. When he had climbed to a sufficient height upon the rope that had dangled into his prison below, and his arms were well within the encircling snares, the 2 priests had pulled quickly upon their ropes, and he had been made an easy captive without any opportunity of defending himself or inflicting injury upon his captors. And now they bound his legs from his ankles to his knees, and picking him up carried him from the chamber. No word did they speak to him as they bore him upward to the temple yard. The din of battle had risen again as Jadon had urged his forces to renewed efforts. Den had not arrived, and the forces of the old chieftain were revealing in their lessened efforts their increasing demoralization, and then it was that the priests carried Tarzan Jadguru to the roof of the palace and exhibited him in the sight of the warriors of both factions. "Here is the false Dorul Otho," screamed Ludon. Burroughs, his shattered mentality having never grasped fully the meaning of much that was going on about him, cast a casual glance at the bound and helpless prisoner, and as his eyes fell upon the noble features of the ape-man, they went wide in astonishment and fright, and his pasty countenance turned a sickly blue. Once before had he seen Tarzan of the Apes, but many times had he dreamed that he had seen him, and always was the giant ape-man avenging the wrongs that had been committed upon him and his by the ruthless hands of the 3 German officers who had led their native troops in the ravishing of Tarzan's peaceful home. Hauptmann Fritz Schneider had paid the penalty of his needless cruelties until Lieutenant von Goss too had paid, and now Burroughs, the last of the 3, stood face to face with the nemesis that had trailed him through his dreams for long, weary months. That he was bound and helpless lessened not the German's terror. He seemed not to realize that the man could not harm him. He but stood cringing and gibbering, and Loudon saw, and was filled with apprehension that others might see, and seeing realized that this bewhiskered idiot was no god. That of the two Tarzan Jadguru was the more godly figure. Already the high priest noted that some of the palace warriors standing near were whispering together and pointing. He stepped closer to Obergatz. "You are Jad Ben Otho," he whispered. "Denounce him." The German shook himself. His mind cleared of all but his great terror, and the words of the high priest gave him the clue to safety. "I am Jad Ben Otho," he screamed. Tarzan looked him straight in the eye. "You are Lieutenant Obergatz of the German army," he said in excellent German. "You are the last of the three I have sought so long, and in your putrid heart you know that God has not brought us together at last for nothing." The mind of Lieutenant Obergatz was functioning clearly and rapidly at last. He too saw the questioning looks upon the faces of some of those around them. He saw the opposing warriors of both cities standing by the gate inactive, every eye turned upon him, and the trussed figure of the ape-man. He realized that indecision now meant ruin, and ruin death. He raised his voice in the sharp, barking tones of a Prussian officer, so unlike his former maniacal screaming as to quickly arouse the attention of every ear, and to cause an expression of puzzlement to cross the crafty face of Loudon. "I am Jad Ben Otho," snapped Obergatz. "This creature is no son of mine. As a lesson to all blasphemers, he shall die upon the altar at the hand of the God he has profaned. Take him from my sight, and when the sun stands at zenith, let the faithful congregate in the temple court and witness the wrath of this divine hand." And he held aloft his right palm. Those who had brought Tarzan took him away then as Obergatz had directed, and the German turned once more to the warriors by the gate. "Throw down your arms, warriors of Jadon," he cried, "lest I call down my lightnings to blast you where you stand. Those who do as I bid shall be forgiven. Come, throw down your arms." The warriors of Jadon moved uneasily, casting looks of appeal at their leader and of apprehension toward the figures upon the palace roof. Jadon sprang forward among his men. "Let the cowards and knaves throw down their arms and enter the palace," he cried, but never will Jadon and the warriors of Jailur touch their foreheads to the feet of Loudon and his false god. "Make your decision now," he cried to his followers. A few threw down their arms and with sheepish looks passed through the gateway into the palace, and with the example of these to bolster their courage, others joined in the desertion from the old chieftain of the north. But staunch and true around him stood the majority of his warriors, and when the last weakling had left their ranks, Jadon voiced the savage cry with which he led his followers to the attack, and once again the battle raged about the palace gate. At times Jadon's forces pushed the defenders far into the palace ground, and then the wave of combat would recede and pass out into the city again, and still Taden and the reinforcements did not come. It was drawing close to noon. Loudon had mustered every available man that was not actually needed for the defense of the gate within the temple, and these he sent, under the leadership of Pansat, out into the city, through the secret passageway, and there they fell upon Jadon's forces from the rear, while those at the gate hammered them in front. Attacked on two sides by a vastly superior force, the result was inevitable, and finally the last remnant of Jadon's little army capitulated, and the old chief was taken a prisoner before Loudon. "Take him to the temple court," cried the high priest. "He shall witness the death of his accomplice, and perhaps Jad Ben Otho shall pass a similar sentence upon him as well." The inner temple court was packed with humanity. At either end of the western altar stood Tarzan and his mate, bound and helpless. The sounds of battle had ceased, and presently the ape-man saw Jadon being led into the inner court, his wrists bound tightly together before him. Tarzan turned his eyes toward Jane and nodded in the direction of Jadon. "This looks like the end," he said quietly. "He was our last and only hope." "We have at least found each other, John," she replied, "and our last days have been spent together. My only prayer now is that if they take you, they do not leave me." Tarzan made no reply, for in his heart was the same bitter thought that her own contained, not the fear that they would kill him, but the fear that they would not kill her. The ape-man strained at his bonds, but they were too many and too strong. A priest near him saw, and with a jeering laugh struck the defenseless ape-man in the face. "The brute," cried Jane Clayton. Tarzan smiled. "I have been struck thus before, Jane," he said, "and always has the striker died." "You still have hope?" she asked. "I am still alive," he said, as though that were sufficient answer. She was a woman, and she did not have the courage of this man who knew no fear. In her heart of hearts she knew that he would die upon the altar at high noon, for he had told her, after he had been brought to the inner court, of the sentence of death that Burroughs had pronounced upon him, and she knew too that Tarzan knew that he would die, but that he was too courageous to admit it even to himself. As she looked upon him standing there so straight and wonderful and brave among his savage captors, her heart cried out against the cruelty of the fate that had overtaken him. It seemed a gross and hideous wrong that that wonderful creature, now so quick with exuberant life and strength and purpose, should be presently naught but a bleeding lump of clay, and also uselessly and wantonly. Gladly would she have offered her life for his, but she knew that it was a waste of words, since their captors would work upon them whatever it was their will to do for him. Death for her, she shuddered at the thought. And now came Loudon and the naked Burroughs, and the high priest led the German to his place behind the altar, himself standing upon the other's left. Loudon whispered a word to Burroughs, at the same time nodding in the direction of Jardon. The Hun cast a scowling look upon the old warrior, and after the false god he cried the false prophet, and he pointed an accusing finger at Jardon. Then his eyes wandered to the form of Jane Clayton. And the woman, too, asked Loudon. The case of the woman I will attend to later, replied Burroughs. I will talk with her tonight after she has had a chance to meditate upon the consequences of arousing the wrath of Jad Ben Otho. He cast his eyes upward at the sun. The time approaches, he said to Loudon. Prepare the sacrifice. Loudon nodded to the priests who were gathered about Tarzan. They seized the ape-man and lifted him bodily to the altar, where they laid him upon his back with his head at the south end of the monolith, but a few feet from where Jane Clayton stood. Impulsively, and before they could restrain her, the woman rushed forward and, bending quickly, kissed her mate upon the forehead. "Goodbye, John," she whispered. "Goodbye," he answered, smiling. The priests seized her and dragged her away. Loudon handed the sacrificial knife to Burroughs. "I am the great God," cried the German. "Thus falleth the divine wrath upon all my enemies." He looked up at the sun, and then raised the knife high above his head. "Thus die the blasphemers of God," he screamed, and at the same instant a sharp staccato note rang out above the silent, spellbound multitude. There was a screaming whistle in the air, and Jad Ben Otho crumpled forward across the body of his intended victim. Again the same alarming noise, and Loudon fell. A third, and Mosar crumpled to the ground. And now the warriors and the people, locating the direction of this new and unknown sound, turned toward the western end of the court. Upon the summit of the temple wall they saw two figures, a Hodon warrior and beside him an almost naked creature of the race of Tarzan, Jadguru. Across his shoulders and about his hips were strange, broad belts studded with beautiful cylinders that glinted in the midday sun. And in his hands a shining thing of wood and metal, from the end of which rose a thin wreath of blue-grey smoke. And then the voice of the Hodon warrior rang clear upon the ears of the silent throng. "Thus speaks the true Jad Ben Otho," he cried through this, his messenger of death. "Cut the bonds of the prisoners, cut the bonds of the Dor al Otho and of Jadon, king of Palul Don, and of the woman who is the mate of the Son of God." Pan sat, filled with the frenzy of fanaticism, saw the power and the glory of the regime he had served crumpled and gone. To one and only one did he attribute the blame for the disaster that had but just overwhelmed him. It was the creature who lay upon the sacrificial altar who had brought Loudon to his death and toppled the dreams of power that day by day had been growing in the brain of the under-priest. The sacrificial knife lay upon the altar where it had fallen from the dead fingers of Burroughs. Pansat crept closer, and then with a sudden lunge he reached forth to seize the handle of the blade, and even as his clutching fingers were poised above it, the strange thing in the hands of the strange creature upon the temple wall cried out its crashing word of doom, and Pansat, the under-priest, screaming, fell back upon the dead body of his master. "Seize all the priests," cried Ta-Den to the warriors, "and let none hesitate lest Jad Ben Otho's messenger send forth still other bolts of lightning." The warriors and the people had now witnessed such an exhibition of divine power as might have convinced an even less superstitious and more enlightened people. And since many of them had but lately wavered between the Jad Ben Otho of Loudon and the Dor al Otho of Jadon, it was not difficult for them to swing quickly back to the latter, especially in view of the unanswerable argument in the hands of him whom Ta-Den had described as the messenger of the great God. And so the warriors sprang forward now with alacrity and surrounded the priests, and when they looked again at the western wall of the temple court they saw pouring over it a great force of warriors. And the thing that startled and appalled them was the fact that many of these were black and hairy Wasdon. At their head came the stranger with the shiny weapon, and on his right was Ta-Den, the Hodon, and on his left Omat, the black gund of Coral J. A warrior near the altar had seized the sacrificial knife and cut Tarzan's bonds and also those of Jadon and Jane Clayton. And now the three stood together beside the altar, and as the newcomers from the western end of the temple court pushed their way toward them, the eyes of the woman went wide in mingled astonishment, incredulity, and hope. And the stranger, slinging his weapon across his back by a leather strap, rushed forward and took her in his arms. "Jack," she cried, sobbing on his shoulder. "Jack, my son." And Tarzan of the Apes came then and put his arms around them both, and the king of Palul-Don and the warriors and the people kneeled in the temple court and placed their foreheads to the ground before the altar where the three stood. Chapter 25. Home. Within an hour of the fall of Ludon and Mosar, the chiefs and principal warriors of Palul-Don gathered in the great throne room of the palace at Allur upon the steps of the lofty pyramid, and placing Jadon at the apex proclaimed him king. Upon one side of the old chieftain stood Tarzan of the Apes, and upon the other Korak, the killer, worthy son of the mighty ape-man. And when the brief ceremony was over and the warriors with upraised clubs had sworn fealty to their new ruler, Jadon dispatched a trusted company to fetch Oloe and Panat Lee and the women of his own household from Jalur. And then the warriors discussed the future of Palul-Don, and the question arose as to the administration of the temples and the fate of the priests, who practically without exception had been disloyal to the government of the king, seeking always only their own power and comfort and aggrandizement. And then it was that Jadon turned to Tarzan. "Let the Dor Iulo transmit to his people the wishes of his father," he said. "Your problem is a simple one," said the ape-man. "If you but wish to do that which shall be pleasing in the eyes of God, your priests, to increase their power, have taught you that Jad Ben Otho is a cruel god, and that his eyes love to dwell upon blood and upon suffering. But the falsity of their teachings has been demonstrated to you today in the utter defeat of the priesthood. Take then the temples from the men and give them instead to the women, that they may be administered in kindness and charity and love. Wash the blood from your eastern altar and drain forever the water from the western. Once I gave Ludon the opportunity to do these things, but he ignored my commands. And again is the corridor of sacrifice filled with its victims. Liberate these from every temple in Palul-Don. Bring offerings of such gifts as your people like and place them upon the altars of your God, and there he will bless them, and the priestesses of Jad Ben Otho can distribute them among those who need them most." As he ceased speaking, a murmur of evident approval ran through the throng. Long had they been weary of the avarice and cruelty of the priests, and now that authority had come from a high source with a feasible plan for ridding themselves of the old religious order without necessitating any change in the faith of the people, they welcomed it. And the priests cried one, "We shall put them to death upon their own altars if it pleases the Dor Otho to give the word." "No," cried Tarzan, "let no more blood be spilled. Give them their freedom and the right to take up such occupations as they choose." That night a great feast was spread in the Palul-Don, and for the first time in the history of ancient Palul-Don, black warriors sat in peace and friendship with white, and a pact was sealed between Jadon and that would ever make his tribe and the Hodon allies and friends. It was here that Tarzan learned the cause of Tieden's failure to attack at the stipulated time. A messenger had come from Jadon carrying instructions to delay the attack until noon, nor had they discovered until almost too late that the messenger was a disguised priest of Ludon. And they had put him to death and scaled the walls and come to the inner temple court with not a moment to spare. The following day Oloe and Panat Lee and the women of Jadon's family arrived at the palace at Allur, and in the great throne room Taden and Oloa were wed, and Onat and Panat Lee. For a week Tarzan and Jane and Korak remained the guests of Jadon, as did Omat and his black warriors, and then the ape-man announced that he would depart from Palul-Don. Hazy in the minds of their hosts was the location of heaven, and equally so the means by which the gods travelled between their celestial homes and the haunts of men, and so no questionings arose when it was found that the Dor Otho with his mate and son would travel overland across the mountains, and out of Palul-Don toward the north. They went by way of the Korul-Ja, accompanied by the warriors of that tribe and a great contingent of Hodon warriors under Taden. The king and many warriors and a multitude of people accompanied them beyond the limits of Allur, and after they had bid them goodbye and Tarzan had invoked the blessings of God upon them, the three Europeans saw their simple, loyal friends prostrate in the dust behind them until the cavalcade had wound out of the city and disappeared among the trees of the nearby forest. They rested for a day among the Korul Jah while Jane investigated the ancient caves of these strange people, and then they moved on, avoiding the rugged shoulder of Pastarul Ved and winding down the opposite slope toward the great morass. They moved in comfort and in safety, surrounded by their escort of Hodon and Wazdon. In the minds of many there was doubtless a question as to how the three would cross the great morass, but least of all was Tarzan worried by the problem. In the course of his life he had been confronted by many obstacles only to learn that he who may always pass. In his mind lurked an easy solution of the passage, but it was one which depended wholly upon chance. It was the morning of the last day that, as they were breaking camp to take up the march, a deep bellow thundered from a nearby grove. The ape-man smiled. The chance had come. Fittingly then would the Doril Otho and his mate and their son depart from unmapped Palal-Ildon. He still carried the spear that Jane had made, which he had prized so highly because it was her handiwork that he had caused a search to be made for it through the temple in Allur after his release, and it had been found and brought to him. He had told her laughingly that it should have the place of honor above their hearth, as the ancient flintlock of her Puritan grandsire had held a similar place of honor above the fireplace of Professor Porter, her father. At the sound of the bellowing, the Hodon warriors, some of whom had accompanied Tarzan from Jadon's camp to Jalur, looked questioningly at the ape-man while Omat's Wazdon looked for trees. Since the Gryph was the one creature of Palal-Ildon which might not be safely encountered even by a great multitude of warriors, its tough, armored hide was impregnable to their knife thrusts, while their thrown clubs rattled from it as futilely as if hurled at the rocky shoulder of Pastarul Ved. "Wait," said the ape-man, and with his spear in hand he advanced toward the Gryph, voicing the weird cry of the Torodon. The bellowing ceased and turned to low rumblings, and presently the huge beast appeared. What followed was but a repetition of the ape-man's previous experience with these huge and ferocious creatures. And so it was that Jane and Korak and Tarzan rode through the morass that hems Palal-Ildon upon the back of a prehistoric triceratops, while the lesser reptiles of the swamp fled hissing in terror. Upon the opposite shore they turned and called back their farewells to Tia Den and Omat, and the brave warriors they had learned to admire and respect. And then Tarzan urged their titanic mount onward toward the north, abandoning him only when he was assured that the Wazdon and the Hodon had had time to reach a point of comparative safety among the craggy ravines of the foothills. Turning the beast's head again toward Palal-Ildon, the three dismounted, and a sharp blow upon the thick hide sent the creature lumbering majestically back in the direction of its native haunts. For a time they stood looking back upon the land they had just quit, the land of Torodon and Gryph of Jah and Jatu of Wazdon and Hodon, a primitive land of terror and sudden death and peace and beauty, a land that they all had learned to love. And then they turned once more toward the north, and with light hearts and brave hearts took up their long journey toward the land that is best of all home. The end. Best audiobooks for free. Hope that you have enjoyed this production of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan the Terrible. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.